Who wrote the Bible? Or specifically, who wrote the New Testament? Well, this video actually sidesteps that question and gets into a framework shift that I think is super important and super clarifying, that I believe God has revealed to me over the process of like the past 10 months, that totally revolutionizes the way we look at authorship versus inspiration. Because when people start going in their faith, one of the stumbling blocks, one of the things that causes people to doubt their faith is how some critical scholars argue that books in the Bible were written by people that isn't actually who they say they were written by, or forgeries, in other words. And this video is here to show you that when we actually study ancient Hebrew society, again, this whole tip I'm on about studying ancient Israel, from that lens, from that cultural parameter, we can see that authorship doesn't determine or disqualify something from being inspired or not. In other words, if we have a religious text and it claims to be written by someone that it wasn't actually written by, that doesn't mean it's not inspired when we look at things from a Hebraic standard, which is the culture that Christ and the apostles came from. So this video is diving into that framework to show that even if the Bible was written by who it said it was written by, and again, I think that it was. I think Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written by those four men. I think all the letters of the Apostle Paul and Peter in them are all authentic. I don't think you could get outside of that without being really ad hoc or really unlikely by the 2nd century. So I'm all for having an objective discourse. I do fully believe that all these things were written by who they said they were written by. But even if it wasn't, here's a framework shift that shows that these things aren't a problem. So if you're somebody who's been struggling with this, as I have, and I was really struggling with this thing about authorship, it really isn't a problem that we think it is. That becomes from the way we look at things in our Western mindset versus the culture that these things came from 2,000 years ago. Right. So if y'all don't want to watch, or y'all don't have time to watch the whole video, here's the main takeaway. All right, and I pray this can be a blessing to the body of Christ. Something can still be inspired even if it was written in the name of someone else when we look at these religious texts in the New Testament from Hebraic parameters. To call it a forgery is to impose a Western standard, a Western presupposition on this ancient genre of writing that we see the Israelite community, the Jewish community actually indulge in prior to Christ. Now, the Book of Enoch is the greatest example. Now, some of my earliest videos on the channel were about the Book of Enoch, but since studying these things some more, I've actually changed my opinion and changed my position about some of the stuff I was saying. Basically, the Book of Enoch is an ancient Hebrew text that describes Genesis 6, right? The episode where the sons of God came into the human woman and produced the Nephilim. The Book of Enoch sort of goes into that whole rabbit hole, and it gives us a glimpse about how Jews in Jesus' day and earlier generations, how they actually interpreted that passage in the divine realm because they were writing things about it. And the Book of Enoch, specifically First Enoch, is the greatest example about that. When we're dealing with Genesis 6 and the Watchers and the Nephilim, everything like that. So why is the Book of Enoch important? Because it was not written by Enoch himself. Now, Enoch was thousands of years before Christ, and I believe he was hundreds of years before Abraham, right? He was taken up by God way before Abraham was ever called. So Enoch was one of the early patriarchs of the Messiah's bloodline. All right, so for Enoch to write this means that thousands upon thousands of years ago, before Moses came, before the law came and the stone tablets, Enoch wrote these things down, and there was an unbreakable preservation of these things throughout all generations, to Jesus' generation, to now, right? But the evidence doesn't support that, because when you look at the oldest manuscript evidence and actually look at the Hebrew, we can sort of get a time window of when it was written and sort of guesstimate when it was written. And the oldest manuscripts we have show that the Book of Enoch was written in the Second Temple period, right? We can date these texts. So even if there was like an ancient tradition that goes back earlier, the first actual writings of this come from the Second Temple period, which is the general time frame after Nebuchadnezzar when they rebuilt the temple to the year 70. All right, so within that general window, we have these things being written by the Hebrew community after the exile. So what this means is the book of Enoch was written by some Israelites much later, and it's given from his perspective. It's given from Enoch's perspective, but it's written by other people. And evidently this was meant to honor Enoch, because if you actually look at certain parts of the book of Enoch, we can see how much Enoch is exalted and called righteous. So much so that the watchers actually try to get Enoch to give him a good word before God after they sin. So in that sense, it's like observing things from his perspective, and it's giving him that honor, even though it's other people writing it from his POV years later. Now, why is this important? Because the New Testament is chock full of stuff from the book of Enoch. And this is it's so dope to study the New Testament because we can see how Hebraic it is, and it's stuff that gets glanced over easily because we're not in that culture. But the types of things that ancient Israelites were thinking in Jesus' day and earlier, those types of ideas get applied to Christ and totally revolutionized and fulfilled in several ways in the New Testament. They're using these cultural ideas and seeing them fulfilled in the Messiah. And some of those ideas are the chains of gloomy darkness that the book of Enoch talks about, appearing in 2 Peter 2:4 and Jude 1:6. So this idea of the spiritual beings who didn't know their place and were put in chains of darkness until the final judgment. This is a New Testament talk about the fallen angels. Well, this is coming from the book of Enoch, which was acknowledged and widespread at the same time, which shows us how the Jews in general thought about Genesis 6. All right, so there's one concept right there between Enoch and the New Testament, but we also have Mount Hermon. Now, Mount Hermon is the place where the fallen angels were said to touch down. The watchers were said to sort of touch down and sort of come up with their plan that they were going to start smashing human women and creating their own seed. Now, I did a video about this called The Genius of the Apostles, where I dive into these types of things in depth to show how the apostles in the New Testament were aware of these things and how Christ fulfilled these things. But the basic idea is there's a lot of concepts that come from the book of Enoch that are thoroughly throughout the New Testament. I recommend reading Reversing Hermon by Michael Heiser, which actually goes into a lot of these comparisons between the ancient Hebrew literature and what we find in the New Testament, which is in itself ancient Hebrew literature. You know what I'm saying? It was written in that culture, in that context, in that time. We even have the New Testament directly quote the book of Enoch in Jude 14. Jude 1:14. It was also about these that Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied, saying, "Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment on all, and to convict all the ungodly of all their deeds of ungodliness that they have committed in such an ungodly way, and all of the harsh things that ungodly sinners have spoken against him." So a lot of repetition chastising the ungodly sinners, right? But he's quoting from the book of Enoch. So what does this mean? All right, we got the book of Enoch and we got the New Testament quoting the book of Enoch and using concepts from the book of Enoch. So not only does the New Testament quote from the book of Enoch, it ascribes the prophecy I just read to Enoch himself. Now what this means for inspiration, it shows that writings that were written by other people in the name of someone else could be at least in part inspired by the true God of Zion. I'm going to say that again. The fact that the New Testament quotes this stuff and uses this stuff shows that writings that were written in the name of other people, things that were given in the point of view of people that weren't actually writing it, were at least in part inspired, because the New Testament directly uses this stuff and sees it as legitimate prophecies given by God that ultimately relate to Christ. Now, by the same metric, the same spirit that did that with the book of Enoch, as we see in Jude, could also have done that with some of the writings of the New Testament, where someone had the Spirit upon them and they wrote in the name of an apostle, just like the Hebrews wrote in the name of Enoch, so that the message that the Lord intended for the church or for the assembly would be the message that he intended to get out. Now, I don't think that's what happens. Again, I think everything was written by who it said it was written by. But this goes to show that the possibility of if the New Testament was written in the name of the apostles is actually consistent with how we see God moving in Hebrew society, where when people would write in the name of other people, we actually see how that gets vindicated at parts, because that stuff is directly in the New Testament, where we see these things ultimately confirmed through the resurrection. And the thing is, there's many other examples too, like the testaments of the 12 patriarchs is another ancient Hebrew book, where it wasn't actually written by the 12 patriarchs, the sons of Jacob. But again, it shows how the ancient Israelite community would often delve into their Old Testament and study their Old Testament from the lens of the characters in the Old Testament, which is sort of like a genre that we've lost, but it's really interesting to observe. And the fact that the New Testament uses a bunch of that stuff, whether it be the Testaments, whether it be Enoch or some other stuff, shows that there is sort of nuance between authorship and inspiration that I think we lose in the modern church, because we just don't think about it in those terms. But you don't have to be the author of something for God to use it logically, and we see that literally confirmed in the pages of Scripture. The other example I want to give are the first and second books of Maccabees. Now, the books of Maccabees are ancient records that deal with how Zion, or the seed of Israel, was fighting against their Greek oppressors. They were led under Judas Maccabeus. This is where the holiday of Hanukkah comes from. So these are historical documents that basically recollect the memory of a generation who actually went through these things, and it was written a little bit after about how all that went down. Now, the mind-blowing thing about 1st and 2nd Maccabees is that the stuff they're writing about, the memory of this generation that witnessed all these battles between the Hebrews and their Greek oppressors, was actually predicted hundreds of years before in the Bible. This is where it gets freaky. This is where it gets astonishing, because we're dealing with stuff, historical records that are confirming things that the Bible said would happen. And there's no way to refute that. Zechariah 9:13, God says through him, "For I have bent Judah as my bow, I have made Ephraim its arrow. I will stir up your sons, O Zion, against your sons, O Greece, and wield you like a warrior's sword." All right. Better yet, the Bible actually predicts Zion would win this conflict before it even happened in verse 15. "The Lord of hosts will protect them, and they shall devour and tread down the sling stones." Skip to verse 16. "On that day, the Lord their God will save them as the flock of his people. Like the jewels of a crown, they shall shine on his land." So Zechariah, who claims to be speaking the words of the Creator to his generation, predicts that there's this war conflict between his people and the Greek people before Greece was ever a world power in the first place. And later, beyond that, he says that after the Jews and the Greeks get in this fight, the people of Zion are going to be victorious. They're going to win. All right, all before that even happened. And we actually see how, against all odds, this has happened, and this has been documented in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Now, why is this important? Because this shows that we don't know who wrote 1st and 2nd Maccabees. We don't know the author of these two books, but what we do know is that they are recorded history of prophecies being fulfilled, right? These things were spoken. We have the generation that went through it. We know the names of the people that were involved, like Judas Maccabeus and his brothers, who were actually involved in these things firsthand. But the people that actually wrote the reports, we don't know. What this proves is that God used anonymous writings as vindication of what he spoke to the prophets of God. God has confirmed his word to the prophets when the people who lived through what he said wrote it down. And the people who wrote it down anonymously. So now we're dealing with both writing in the name of someone else and writing something anonymously being done with the sanction, or maybe a little less technically, the approval and the will of God. God used an anonymous work, meaning we don't know the author, to show his people and later the church, the assembly of all those who would gather to God on account of Jesus. He would use these works to show how truthful and meticulous his prophecies were. Not only did he say these things, but we can examine these records outside of the Bible that show the exact times and days and the people involved of when they were fulfilled. So when we understand that Jesus and the apostles came from this culture, and the New Testament writings came from this culture, what we see is that the question of who wrote these things does not undercut at all the fact that they were inspired by God. They're inspired by God based on the fact that Jesus was the Messiah. And because of that, these writings, which are consistent with one another, and the writings we have in the New Testament are cool with one another in terms of its teaching, in terms of its substance. A question of who specifically wrote them, if we want to say that it wasn't who church tradition says it was, it's still Gucci, it's still cool, it's still inspired either way, because God has already shown us by the point the church even begins that he has used these things to prepare us for this discussion, that he's used things written in the other name, written in the names of other people. He has used things that were written anonymously and vindicated them because of how they're used and fulfilled in the New Testament. So I'm so zealous about this because I really used to struggle, and put a lot of stock into this question of who wrote the New Testament, right? Because a lot of the critical scholars, such as Bart Ehrman, will protest the traditional authors like Paul, Peter, Jude, and Martha, Mark, Luke, or John for some of the New Testament. Now, after getting into the ring a little bit, I'm even more convinced that it was actually those guys who wrote it. But even if I were to put that aside, the principle from the original culture shows us that if Jesus truly is the Messiah, that question is something not to worry about anyways. So this is not something that Christians should be doubting or losing their faith over. I perfectly understand why, because that was me. But the principle is there that authorship and inspiration are not mutually exclusive. Now, what does this mean? This ultimately brings us back to keep the main thing the main thing. When trying to discern the truth of the gospel, the most important thing for any human being to study is Jesus Christ himself. Because when we study Jesus Christ from what we can, get to him from what we have, even if we don't use the disputed letters, even if we go from the Gospels and the historical testimony that is preserving about this man named Jesus who was sent to Israel, and the lot of first-hand writings of the Apostle Paul, who believed he had encountered the risen Christ and turned his whole life around to the point of death. When we actually look at what we do have, we can actually get to the Messiah showing up in ancient Israel. And when we can get to Christ showing up to Israel as a historical figure, then we can actually study Christ and see all these different things that vindicate him, whether it be prophecy and the effect he had on the world, whether it be the things that happened to him in his ministry outside of his control that also aligned with what the prophets had spoken, whether it be just the evidence for the resurrection on its own merit, but even contemporary things that show that Christ's name has power. There's a whole realm of a whole bunch of different things that we can study after we're introduced to Christ from the New Testament, which was written very close to the original events of these things. So what this all means is when we can get to the true Christ and actually study him and put him under scrutiny and are actually able to vindicate Christ, then everything else, including this debate, falls into question, falls into the pieces of the puzzle. Because if Christ is who he said he was, then that confirms the entire Old Testament, right? Because these are the scriptures of the Jews, which is the people group that Christ came from, that he came to save and he came to fulfill the scriptures of. And it also sets a mist of reliability over the New Testament. Why? Because the New Testament is the messianic writings that were written to report Jesus and let the Hebrews know and later the Gentiles that the Messiah had come. So if Christ is truly the Messiah, then that means the writings left to preserve his name and to proclaim him are also reliable, even if they weren't written by who they said they were written by. Because within that culture, that was a category. That was okay. That was an okay thing to do. So if Christ is risen and he's truly at the right hand of God, and we know he generally preserves the church so that nothing, no evil forces will prevail against it, and we know that in his own culture, it was a category possibility to write in the name of other people. If that is the case with the New Testament, then it falls right into place between both of those intersections of the true resurrected Messiah who revealed himself to us, the divine cloud rider of Israel, and the writing in the name of other people that we see in Enoch or all these other types of things. So when we can see that the teachings of the New Testament are all fundamentally consistent with each other and lock hands with each other and with the entire Bible for that matter, and we can see how over the time and over the days and years and centuries, the entire church sort of came to an agreement about what we have now in our current Bibles as the New Testament, and how Africa actually played a huge role in the so-called canon. Athanasius the Great specifically, who was an Egyptian believer, and actually relying on them in terms of what makes up the bookends of the New Testament, right? Because the main stuff was always agreed on, but in terms of like the bookends, some of the less popular, less big books, seeing how we all sort of came to an agreement on that throughout church history and the role the African church played in sort of solidifying that. I admit that last part is a little subjective, but just for the sake of putting it all on the table, we can look all of that in the face. We can see God in those things. We see God in those things because of these principles from the ancient promised land that we bring into mind when we look through the church or the assembly that Christ established. Now, all that being said, I really pray this video would be an encouragement to the body of Christ, because this shows that we can be rest assured that everything in the Bible is meant to be there. Even if the writings of Paul weren't written by Paul, even if the book of Peter wasn't written by Peter, even if Matthew wasn't written by Matthew, I would say all of those things are complete W's and written by who they said they were. But even if they weren't, we can look at the culture that Christ came from and study these things diligently and see that God was preparing us for this discussion so that we can look back and see that even if they weren't written by who they said they were, Christ was still risen. He is risen. And the writing in the name of someone else was often honorific, giving the person honor from writing in their perspective, like we see in the book of Enoch. So if someone was doing that with the apostles, writing in their name as a means to give them respect or as a means to communicate what the Lord wants to the church if they were being led by the Spirit, if it was truly someone else, that is totally consistent with what God has always been doing among the saints. So it's just a little interesting thing to think about. The whole purpose of this video is to give a framework shift. Right? When we understand these things Hebraically, authorship does not condemn something as being uninspired. So people can't use the question of authorship or the fact that certain things are disputed to say these things don't belong in the Bible. It's as simple as that. So if anyone is struggling with this, I really pray this video would be encouraging. Don't take my word for it. Just pray the Lord will lead you into all truth and actually study these things diligently. If you'll find any new conclusions about this, please light up the comments and let me know what y'all think. All right, let's have a nice, respectful, civil discourse about all of these things with the God of Zion as our top priority, the Most High God, as the one who gave us these brains to talk and reason through these things, all right? But y'all be blessed. Thank God and praise God for these things, these principles that we can look into, apply into our daily lives. Y'all who recognize the Messiah, y'all be blessed. And I will see you all in the next video. All right, peace.